Alrighty, everyone, let's start out the podcast with something that will hopefully bring you guys some joy, because these series of films bring me a lot of joy. Let's talk about Paddington in Peru. The Paddington series has quietly become one of the most successfully critically acclaimed series of movies in a long time. The first couple films approached 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. And this third film, even though Paul King, the director, was not returning to direct it, it looked like it had all the ingredients for a successful third film in the franchise. And we've also gotten confirmation from the director, I believe, that they are actively in development of the fourth film. And I think this is a series that could just go on and on and on. For those of you who remember reading when you were children, the Mary Poppins books, those books just went on for a long while. There were many of them, and just many adventures with these characters. And I feel like the Mary Poppins sort of vibe is what these Paddington movies evoke. The whimsy, the joy, the nurturing kindness, and just the genuine good characters that these films have, including, of course, Paddington himself. So I went out and saw Paddington in Peru a week late, admittedly, but I still wanted to talk about it here on the YouTube channel. We're going to be doing a non-spoiler and spoiler review. It's going to be, relatively quick. Admittedly, there's not a whole lot to spoil. Well, there are a couple things to spoil that I want to talk about later on. But, I wanted to, I put out these reviews for films that frankly are not as big as Captain America Brave New World or whatever, because I think that there are films that are worth seeing and worth talking about, And so I hope that you guys can go check out the first two films if you haven't already, but also you would be willing to check out the third film in theaters while it is still here. It released on the same day as Captain America Brave New World. So let's get into my non-spoiler thoughts for Paddington in Peru. First of all, it's an interesting film because it's different than the first two Paddington films because, well, it's in the name. Paddington is in Peru. If you've seen the trailers, you know that he travels to Peru for various reasons. So that is one key difference for the film. And I will say that it was a little bit jarring because the first two films were so London-centric, and it's about Paddington finding his home, being with his people. The second film was different from the first film, certainly, because, spoiler alert for that film, he was in prison for most of it, and then he gets out and all that stuff. But, I think it's interesting that Paddington is now taking a new adventure off into a different continent altogether, and so that definitely changes the style of the film, and certainly the tone. The tone of the film, while, yes, keeping the same sort of whimsy and mysteriousness, amongst some of the other side characters and whatnot, but also the joy with Paddington himself, who is, by the way, great. Brad Winshaw, I believe, is the voice actor, and he is just fantastic as always. The supporting cast, it's sad to see Sally Hawkins not return to play Mrs. Brown. Emily Mortimer steps into the role, and I have some issues with the characters of especially Mrs. Brown, but we'll talk about that I think a little more in the spoiler discussion. I think for the most part the side characters are there to serve their purposes, and they do a good job there. So anyways, going back to Paddington himself, he is in Peru, and it's more of an adventure style film, more of a search style film, which I know the first couple films, like it was about the map and the book and whatnot, and it was also kind of an adventure film. The first film was more with Nicole Kidman, and so it's a little different, right? It's a little bit tonally different. And I will say the first chunk of the movie, and there are portions throughout the movie that just feel a little slapstick and a little silly, which I know it's kind of ridiculous to say, because these Paddington films have always relied on that sort of slapstick nature, right? You have, the scene in the first movie with the tub, obviously, and the prison scenes and whatnot. So, I mean, yes, there is always physical comedy and physical humor in these films, but I think this film, more so than the other ones, relied a little bit more on visual gags and some of those things. But again, it's still a fun film, right? It's still fun, and it has that sense of adventure. It actually reminds me quite a bit thematically of another third film in a franchise. I want to see if you guys can guess that. Leave it in the comments down below, and then we'll get to it in the spoiler discussion. But thematically, the film is about searching for something, which I will not reveal in this review, in this portion of the review at least. But it's just as endearing as you remember. Basically, what it boils down to is if you enjoyed the first two films, I think that it's almost guaranteed you're going to enjoy this film. I don't know to what extent you will enjoy the movie. I think that for me, I really like the first two films, and I definitely like this third film, and I want to see them continue to make these movies. I think for me, being outside of London was the biggest thing that sort of put Paddington out of his element, both in the movie, but also for me as an audience member. And I think that, again, they do all the right things, they have all the right moments, and the ending is very sweet and it's very lovely. But and there are some very genuinely funny moments, and there are some very interesting side characters as well. And I think the plot itself is somewhat predictable, but also that's just the way that things go with these Paddington films. And I think that if you're looking for that same kind of joy and whimsy, that you found in the first two Paddington films, definitely you'll find it here, but perhaps not in the same dosages of marmalade that you found in the first two films, is my general assumption, although I could be wrong. Some of you guys might think this is the best out of the three. So those are my quick non-spoiler thoughts for Paddington in Peru. Really liked it. Genuinely was a good time, and it made my heart smile at the end, and really brought some tears to my eyes at the end of the film as well. Let's quickly get to my spoiler thoughts for Paddington in Peru. If you have not seen the film, just make sure to watch it, or save this segment for later, and then come back if you have seen the film, or if you don't care about spoilers, let's continue on. So I was alluding to another franchise with a third film that felt very similar, and I was actually thinking about Kung Fu Panda. Kung Fu Panda, it was sort of the, return home, right? So that they find the hidden village with Po and his father, and it felt kind of similar, El Dorado being the place where Paddington originally came from, which I thought was very sweet. And of course, the ending scene with Paddington and, saying, can he return home to the Browns was adorable, and it was sweet, and it really genuinely brought a tear to my eye. It was great. And I think that is the Paddington kind of spirit, right? That's the closest it felt like to Paul King, who directed Paddington 1 and 2, and Wonka, that kind of style and that kind of heart. And I really, really enjoyed that. Going to really my biggest complaint, and I feel bad saying this because it's not like it's really anyone's fault. I know that Sally Hawkins didn't return for Paddington in Peru because she just felt like it was time to leave the character, and that's all well and good. And they replaced her with Emily Mortimer, who I remember from Mary Poppins Returns, I believe. But I think it's interesting because the ending and really the emotional crux of the movie. And actually, it's so interesting because there is a flashback to when Paddington was first discovered on the train station, and it is Sally Hawkins who is speaking there, but you don't see her face because, of course, they can't show her face because then it would confuse audience members who hadn't seen the previous two films, right? So you don't see her face. And it's so interesting because the emotional crux of the movie is really hinging on Mrs. Brown, whether she can let go of Paddington or not. And I think Emily Mortimer is a great actress, but I was missing the entire movie, the joyous, bouncy nature of Sally Hawkins' version of the character. Because I'm going to be honest, Emily Mortimer, I don't know if it was the direction or whatever it was, the acting choices, she played the version of Mrs. Brown much more subdued. And it felt like she had just less energetic than Sally Hawkins did. And even besides the point, even if Emily Mortimer was mimicking every single thing from Sally Hawkins in the first two films, it's just hard because you want the through line, right? You want to see in the flashback, at the very end of the movie when Paddington is deciding whether to stay or not. You want to see Sally Hawkins' face because that's the character that we've followed through the first three films. I'm really surprised, honestly, how much that stuck with me throughout the movie. It's like it's a side character. It's not even, she's not even one of the main characters. She's not Paddington, right? But I really felt the absence there, and I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. And on top of that, like I said, Paddington being out of his element was it was a little hard for me to get on board with, but eventually you kind of get on board with it. And again, overall, when he says, can I stay with you? It was just that moment. It's that moment that you look for in these films. So I really enjoyed the movie, and for those of you who haven't seen it and are listening to the spoiler section, I don't know, maybe you guys love spoilers, which, okay, welcome. But I would still encourage you guys very much to see Paddington in Peru. Have you guys seen it? And what did you think about it? Let me know in the comments down below.